Hey everybody, welcome to the second video, which means you've made it to the second week of class. Great job. Yay. Today I want to talk a little bit about some of the concepts in the textbook. So if you've got that available, I'm going to make some references to pages so you can pull that out. If not, you can just follow along. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the great posts in this week's discussion board and about what we'll be doing next week. So let's go ahead and get started. The chapter on narration in our textbook gives us some really good ideas for drafting this week. And so it starts off talking about how we brainstorm to write a narrative, which is the who, what, when, where, why, how components that kind of create the skeleton of our narrative. Now, if we were to just write who, what, where, when, why, how, we would have a summary of our story, but we don't want a summary. We want a narrative. So this is where we start to fill the meat in on the bones of that outline. So you're going to add the details and the imagery and the dialogue that make a narrative a narrative. So starting with the questions who, what, where, when, why are a great place to think through ideas and brainstorm, and then add the details after that. I do want to point out a couple things. On page 102, it shows templates for drafting, and it gives some examples of what a thesis statement might be in a narrative, such as, this is a story about, or my point in telling this story is to show that blank. I am going to recommend you do not do that. As we read narratives, we see that it's really the person's details that bring us in and hook us to their story, and not necessarily that they tell us what they're going to tell us. Later in other essays this session, we will use thesis statements, but they're rare in a narrative. So I'm going to tell you to forget what you read on page 102 and really just hook us with the story itself. And don't worry about telling us what you're going to tell us. A few other things in the book to think about. Page 103 talks about following chronological order. That's when we tell the story beginning, middle, end. And that may work really well. You may be telling an anecdote from kindergarten, and then a story from high school, and then a story from college years or adulthood or parenthood. But don't feel stuck to that, younger, middle age, older, because oftentimes we might want to begin our story, open our story at the end, and then the rest of our narrative is actually a flashback, and then at the end of the story we return to present day. So be creative, don't feel stuck in that chronological pattern, and see what works best for the story that you have to tell. Page 103 and 104 talks about developing a plot, talks about kind of that plot chart where we have the exposition, the climax, and then the resolution. That's a very standard structure for a narrative, but realize that yours might not follow that exactly, because you may be sharing anecdotes that have a little bit of plot and then goes back, and then you share your next anecdote, and we have its own little mini plot graph, and then you share our next anecdote. And so rather than thinking about this as one singular plot that has that beginning, middle, and end, you may need to consider it as a bunch of little mini stories that you're threading together to show the big picture of your literacy. So on page 103, developing a plot, don't feel stuck necessarily in that traditional structure either. Talks a bit about verb tense. Make sure you're being aware of the tense you're using. Talks about point of view on page 105 and 106. This one is really important. This is a first-person narrative. So that means you should be using I, me, my. Watch out for using the second person pronoun you. A lot of students have a bad habit of saying you unless it's in dialogue. If somebody's speaking, then they can use the word you. But otherwise, if you use the word you, you're kicking the narrative out of your own story and putting it back to your reader. So remember, this is personal story, personal narrative of your literacy, and so it should be always focused on I, me, my. Watch out for the word you, and students oftentimes don't even know they're using it. And then dialogue is going to be an important part of this. We don't want long stretches of dialogue, but we can have short, impactful statements, pieces of dialogue that help show the story, help us hear the events that were happening. Students often struggle with correct punctuation for dialogue, and if you look on page 108, the textbook actually shows you correct punctuation, so make sure you visit that as well. So if you have any questions while you're drafting this week, you can refer to the textbook, and you can also send me an email. I'm happy to help. Let's switch gears and think about the discussion boards from this week. I loved the quotes you guys picked out. And as you'll notice, I went back and responded to many students and really dug a little bit deeper at how the author wrote those quotes, not just what they wrote or how we connected to them or what they meant, but literally what was the word choice, what was the sentence structure, what was the tone, how did they create those quotes that really kind of stuck with us. Caitlin, and along with a few others, picked out Sherman Alexi's quote, I refused to fail, I was smart, I was arrogant, I was lucky. So powerful. And one of the things we note about that is it's very simple, short sentence structure. Sherman Alexie didn't use compound, complex sentences to create this long, drawn-out, detailed statement of his experience. And so sentence structure that really packed a punch, right? Each of those. Refused to fail, I was smart, I was arrogant, I was lucky. There's also repetition of sentence structure. The I was. Sometimes we might think of that as being bad, but here it's very effective. Ryan pointed out Douglas's quote about the letters upon a piece of timber in the shipyard, and how the boys challenged him and said, I don't believe you. Let me see you try it. Great examples of where Douglas used details, talking about the letters on a piece of timber in the shipyard, and using dialogue. He didn't just say the boys tested me or challenged me. He actually used the words that we could hear that the boys were using when they were talking to Douglas. So great example of details and dialogue. Robin pointed out the quote about Douglas being so desperate he felt like killing himself. So strong, so honest, so raw. Douglas didn't just say it was hard or it was really difficult. He dug into the true emotions and his true response. And because of that, it elicits such a strong response in us as readers. So think about where are the points in your own narrative that could touch on being really honest and really raw and exposing that part of us that we otherwise might kind of just skim over and just kind of say, oh, it was really tough. And dig a little deeper into those, because that's where the really powerful writing comes from. So great stuff in this week's discussion board, and it will help us move our writing forward. So when we dig a little bit deeper, why did we connect? Why did we pull out those quotes? We can see that as inspiration for our own writing and techniques and strategies to include to make us better writers. So looking ahead next week, June 7th, you have your rough draft due. Make sure you're also looking in the textbook for MLA formatting and citation rules, because you will include a couple quotes in this. Go ahead and go back to the Essay 1 assignment to refresh your memory of the requirements for this assignment. But pages 810 to 836 in our textbook have all the MLA stuff. If you don't have a textbook yet, you can Google that and you'll find lots. Purdue OWL, O-W-L, site is excellent for MLA references. You're going to post your rough draft. I'm going to give everybody feedback on Friday, and then on June 10th, on Sunday night, your final draft is due. One note, if you are able to submit your rough draft earlier than June 7th, I will get feedback to you as quickly as possible. So that way I'm not giving everybody feedback in one single day. But if you turn it in earlier, post it to that forum earlier, I will get you feedback earlier. So let me know if you have any questions this week. I'm here to help, and I really look forward to reading your drafts. Have a great day.